Welcome to Season 2 of the Pivot Point podcast. This season, we are featuring Candid Conversations. We're interviewing industry experts and leaders about candid conversations they've had that involve gender in some way. They're going to fill us in on what happened, what prevented them from addressing it, the risks they took in that conversation, why they chose to say something and how they handled it, and what happened next. Stay tuned for Pivotal Stories, a Positive Change. In the studio, we have Caroline Dowd-Higgins, who is a sought-after public speaker, a best-selling author, and an executive coach, and international media personality. A certified Marshall Goldsmith stakeholder-centered executive coach, Caroline believes great things happen when you find your mojo and work to keep it alive in life and career. She has developed a powerful content and programs that have help thousands of women find greater satisfaction in their work and life. She empowers women with tools and action steps to navigate the issues of engagement, retention, and talent alignment in the workplace so that they can integrate the realities of work and life and thrive. Caroline is a New York City native, now based in the Midwest, working on her alma mater as Executive Director of Career and Professional Development for the Indiana University Alumni Association. We're so excited to have you, Caroline. Welcome.
Thanks, Julie. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, as we do with all our guests, we would love for you to share a candid conversation you've had about gender in the workplace or personally and or professionally.
Julie, I'm so grateful that you're giving so many of your guests a chance to talk about this. And I really think it's important for us to be transparent and really move the needle with action. So thank you for being brave and giving us a platform to address this. So I'm going to talk about a scenario. I'm going to change names to protect the innocent and the not so innocent. But I'm going to describe a scenario where I had what I'm going to call an intervention with a colleague whose personal space was being invaded inappropriately from a gentleman. And it'll make more sense when I clarify this. You know, whether it is inequality in our financial realm with salary or leadership opportunities or sexual harassment, there's so many different ways to slice it and different definitions. And I think we need to be aware of behavior on all levels, not just verbal, and promotional, for example, with advancement, but we also need to be aware of body language. So let me set this up. So we were at a networking reception that was wonderfully robust with a lot of men and women. And one of my colleagues was being pursued by a gentleman. And it was pretty clear, and this was a client, right? So it was a business contact, someone who was invited to this event. It was pretty clear that she was very uncomfortable. And I was watching her across the room, and this gentleman really cornered her. And while he didn't necessarily make any verbal sexual advances, his physical space was crowding her to a point that I could really see she was uncomfortable and didn't know how to get out of that scenario. So I wanted to give her a chance to phone a friend, right?
Sure.
And I took it upon myself to insert myself in that conversation. Very strategically welcomed myself in, shook hands with the gentleman whom I did not know, and give my colleague a safe space support so she was not alone in that scenario. And she was very grateful after the fact. And she said, you know, he just trapped me in this corner. And while he didn't make inappropriate advances or say anything, it made her feel extremely uncomfortable. And whether it was unconscious or conscious, this gentleman behaved inappropriately. And it was a learning moment for all of us, for me to open up the physical space of that scenario, get her out of the corner, literally, and interject my person, my body. So that was a three-way conversation.
Yep.
So she felt more empowered. And it was a really interesting moment for the two of us to be more aware of all the other women and men in our space and be observant and be there to really dive in when needed. And I'll tell you, it was something that I remember to this day. It happened a few months ago and has made me so much more cognizant of physical space.
Well, what I love so much about that example, Caroline, is that you inserted yourself and made the space safe again for her.
Yeah. Thank you. That means a lot to me because you could tell she was floundering, right? And I thought, okay, how can we get in there and save her? And I thought, even if this guy doesn't think he's doing any harm, even if it's unintentional, doesn't matter. She feels uncomfortable, right? So how do we make her have a safe space?
Well, and I learned in bystander training that, a bystander, you could easily witness something like that and sense the discomfort and just stand there and watch it or leave because it's really awkward and uncomfortable.
Right.
But I love that you stepped in and chose not to be a bystander and to do something about it in a way that created safety, not discomfort around the issue. And like you said, it could be conscious or unconscious. He may not have an understanding of spatial distance needed for people. People do have different degrees of comfort with people in their space. However, especially in a post, in current Me Too era, as you know, working with women leaders, we really are at a place where that safety net, that line in the sand needs to be drawn more clearly, because we're seeing examples of that behavior of people simply not understanding what those boundaries are. And so sometimes we have to draw them for them.
Yeah, you nailed it. And I'm so grateful that you mentioned bystander training because we are all part of this equation, right? It's not of them and us, and it's not completely gender-based. We've got to be observant and aware of our colleagues and ourselves. And we had a wonderful opportunity, the women and men in my organization, to really debrief at a staff meeting days later in a safe space to say, this happened. And let us be more aware of how we have the backs of our colleagues, men and women, so we can be more supportive. And it caused a wonderful conversation and allowed us to be more of a together team environment where we can support each other and look out for each other.
Well, and so even further, right? You could have just dealt with the issue, addressed it head on, and then swept it under the rug. Right. Okay. That's over with. We don't have to deal with that anymore because I think as humans, there's this natural tension about these candid conversations that we just want them to be done. Yeah. But instead, bringing it to the forefront again and using it as a learning opportunity in a team setting to say, hey, this happened. Let's talk about how to prevent this in the future. Let's talk about what to recognize, what behaviors are going to be important in future scenarios if this happens. And so what I like about that is you're already drawing ground rules for future situations. And usually that prevents it from happening again, just defining that because people become aware of the behavior to look for. And so naturally they're guarded and consciously bring that into their mindset of not doing those behaviors. And so it changes the mindset around more productive behavior in the workplace and promotes that behavior to happen more. But worst case scenario, it happens again. You have some ground rules and know what good looks like.
Yeah, and we were able as a group, as a staff, to have that safe space conversation to talk about how might she verbally respond to this gentleman or any woman for that matter, right? That also invaded that personal space and made her feel unsafe. Because in the moment, you're caught off guard and the adrenaline's running and often we lose our words.
Yep.
So she now has some, what I will call script bits that she can carry around with her mentally and use at a moment's notice if she's ever put in that predicament again.
I really like that, script bits. That's a great learning nugget for our listeners. So along that same vein, Caroline, what happens, if you have an unpleasant situation happen at work, and often it's not as blatant as this one, right? Seeing visible, safety being broached. But, maybe it's an interruption. Maybe it's a colleague taking credit for a woman's idea. I mean, these things tend to be much more common for women than for men. And I'm just curious, what do those script bits look like in this situation when you have to call out maybe what we call a microaggression, a subtle behavior, but one that's not okay? What would you recommend to our listeners on how to call that out? What would those script bits look like?
It's interesting because as a coach, I'm hearing my female clients talk about this more and more, and some of my male clients. So again, it is not just a single gender issue. And the first approach that I always encourage them to consider is have a private conversation with the individual in a time that is scheduled, so it's not a drive-by, so you can be very well prepared and bring it up in a calm manner. So it's not accusatory, in a neutral tone, to say, this made me feel uncomfortable. Let's talk about that. And let's set up ground rules. And then also have the spirit of reciprocity to say, how can I better communicate with you? So it's not just a one-sided accusation. So you're open to constructive feedback about how they would like to be treated. And you set behavior, as you mentioned, you set ground rules. So that's one technique that I would encourage anyone listening to try.
Yeah, I like the spirit of reciprocity, not just pointing the finger one way, but being receptive also to feedback.
Yeah.
Builds trust. It shows a willingness that, hey, I'm not here to, deliver a negative message just to you, but I'm also receptive. There's something I can be doing in this situation to, prevent being interrupted, or to make sure that my ideas are attributed to me. What could I be doing differently? How could I be contributing to the situation? Which I think usually, when you're vulnerable like that, no one's going to attack you, right? The victim's not going to be re-victimized, but it does build trust and engages that other person to kind of mirror that same vulnerability and say, maybe I did mess up. I appreciate you, making that said. I didn't understand when you said this. This is what you meant. And so then it just opens up kind of that dialogue to be much more robust and much more clear, and kind of less monitoring of what you're going to say, and say what you really mean without being mean.
Right. Because if you go in, blazing and having anger, it's not always well received. And the defense wall goes up for the person with whom you're speaking, and emotions prevail. It's similar to negotiating. You have to neutralize the emotions and approach it in a way that is developmental and with gratitude. Thank you for listening to me. That means a lot. Let's work through this together and figure out a way that works for both of us. And while we're at it, how can I help you? How can I communicate better with you?
Love it. Yeah, the emotional intelligence, like you said, in negotiation situations, I see this a lot more so with women than with men, but conflict as well, because we want to preserve the relationship, right? We're kind of wired and socialized to make sure people are happy, that we're building communities and getting collaboration, and we're so afraid of burning a bridge on a relationship, or shutting that relationship down, or turning somebody off, that it can prevent us from having these tough conversations that, on the other side of it, we know as coaches that usually is a healthier and stronger relationship when you can talk candidly.
And I want to give another example, because a gentleman client of mine shared with me that a female client in his organization called him out blatantly in a staff meeting when he did admittedly do something inappropriate verbally. He made a reference that was inappropriate, and he knew that he had said something inappropriate. He could see the body language and the reaction of this person. And she called him out immediately. And he said to me, she was right, but that public shaming did not sit well, right? And he said, I wish she would have come and spoken with me privately, and I would have owned it and been accountable, and we could have built a bridge together moving forward. He said, now I don't think our relationship can recover. Happily, we're working toward recovery, because of course you want to maintain that relationship. But his immediate reaction was hurt and okay, we're done. We're just never going to have the same relationship. So emotions are complicated. They really are.
They are. Well, and I'm glad you brought up the public versus one-on-one, because I find this is a big challenge for people. They're like, well, so I address it in the moment so that someone knows exactly what they said. I think you're right. That can be a very shaming experience for somebody. It's very embarrassing for men that want to protect their egos, and for women alike. I mean, no one wants to be embarrassed publicly.
Right.
And certainly in a team setting, you're going to lose respect from your peers. So that's a lot of negative consequences of a public call out. Instead, what I usually offer is as close as possible to the time of which it happened. So right after that meeting, if you can just ask for 2 minutes of that person's time and say, hey, can we go for a walk? I heard you say this in the meeting. I don't think you meant to cause harm, or I don't think you meant it this way. Here's how I perceived it. Right. And so then it's less personal. It's not about you being a jerk. It's not about you being an awful person. It's about the behavior and the perception. And so usually people can see in the moment, like, I did say that. I could see why you might think that. And just simply asking the question, how would you do that differently next time? Or do you understand what I'm saying? Or,
Yeah.
help me understand where you were coming from there. Or what did you mean? Are really safe ways to call it out in the form of a question rather than a shameful remark of don't do that again.
And I love your immediacy, right? To say right after the meeting, can we take a walk? And again, that neutralizes it too. So it's not someone shaking their finger saying you did this wrong or
Right.
this is inappropriate, right? It's a neutral territory. Let's take a walk. Let's talk this out together. I like that.
Yeah. Well, on the walk, as we know, right, it kind of it burns off those emotions. Then
Yes.
it neutralizes. To your point about neutralizing, it's harder to have a high tone. And it's the
Yeah.
facial expressions. You're not sending mixed messages, and you're side by side, as we often share with our allies. Your allies are side by side with you, and so that side by side trust building, just body positioning signals. Hey, we're not adversarial here. We're about the same thing. We're working towards the same thing.
Exactly.
Well, Caroline, you have such a successful coaching, speaking, podcasting business. I'd love for our listeners to know, what's the backstory? How did you get all of this started?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, just a 30-second nod to my first career so the audience can put that in context. The first decade of my career was as a professional opera singer. And that was a very, very different career, which I loved while it lasted. But the world of the arts is unpredictable. And I was struggling at that point to maintain financial solvency and made a clear decision to reinvent. But I say that because before that, I had the meltdown of, oh my goodness, what is happened next, right? And in full vulnerability and candor, because my education and my career path was very linear. I knew exactly what I wanted. So when I had that meltdown moment of, my goodness, what's next? It really gave me this wonderful opportunity to self-reflect and think about other skills and strengths and interests that I had never honored or even considered. And to be really candid and upfront, I had some extraordinary people, many of whom are still part of my life and my career, who were coaches and mentors and advisors and sponsors who helped me pull back the layers and figure out what I do well. And through that career development process, I thought, wow, this is extraordinary. I really enjoy this. And fell in love with a new career that I didn't even know existed, which was career and professional development. And as a performer, there's a definite correlation between keynoting and training. I love working with groups. I love an audience, and I love delivering a message. So I like to say I'm just singing a different tune.
I love that so much. That's great. And I love that you speak to a career being linear, but also being a little non-linear. And I know you help, you as well as we help women kind of build a career for the future that works for them. And I really like how you're focusing on work and life. And with that in mind, I know you've got some ways our listeners can connect with you and continue to follow you. So your book, your podcast, let our listeners know how they can best connect and learn more from you.
Yeah, Julie, I like to think of myself as a content machine, and I don't mean that in a factory sense, but I love content. I'm really fascinated by it. So I write, I have a blog, I have a podcast, as you mentioned, I have a video series, and the mothership for all of that is probably the best place to find me, and that would be at my website, which is Dowd-Higgins.com. And of course, iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and all the other platforms can be accessed there as well. But the website is a wonderful repository for all that content.
Yeah.
And that's been a great joy to be able to share resources, because I know you believe in this philosophy as well. Coaching is not just about motivation. It's providing, in our case, women with extraordinary resources that they can put into action, right?
Mm-hmm.
We want to give you things that you can use to make your life better.
Yeah. Yeah. And so along with that, on CarolineDowd-Higgins.com, the book, This Is Not the Career I Ordered, is a great read. I highly recommend, as well as the podcast, Your Working Life. So we'll link to all those in the show notes, but I love pumping out content myself. It's so fun to answer the questions that you hear in the hallways of organizations and the things that keep people up at night. Like, there are solutions, right? You don't have to dwell on this.
Right.
There's content out there that is easy to digest and can help people. And of course, hire you as a speaker and work with you as well inside organizations. So Caroline, it has been a sincere pleasure to have you on today. I am so proud to know you. And, I'm thankful 2 years ago when I first reached out and connected with you. You were so kind and helpful and sharing resources, sharing ideas with me. And I sincerely appreciate, you taking me under your wing and helping me. And I truly believe in your work and am so thankful to have you as someone I can learn from and watch you and learn from you.
Oh, Julie, thanks. That means the world to me. And it's such a pleasure to see you thriving. And, in the spirit of collaboration, we're all in this together. So I am grateful to have you out there as a resource and someone that I learned from as well. So thank you.
Thank you. In the studio today, I have Zane Davis. He is currently pursuing his MBA at Indiana University, my alma mater. And Zane is from Indianapolis after having studied economics and photography at IU a little over a decade ago. He pursued a career in the business side of the photo industry. After leading e-commerce teams in both Chicago and outside of London, he decided to return to IU for an MBA. At IU, he's been a part of an effort to start a male allies group, the Manbassadors, alongside Kelly's Association of Women MBAs. And that was an organization I had a chance to participate on the leadership team. So Zane, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Well, in preparing for today's conversation, so Zane and I, we've known each other, I think over the course of this year, and I love the work you're doing with the Ambassadors, and Kelly has such a great culture there for collaboration and truly wanting to bring more gender diversity into the program. And I know I graduated, 8 years ago now, it was, we're hovering in the mid-20s with women in the program, and I know we're moving the needle. We're definitely advancing that. Despite our best efforts, though, it's challenged a lot of MBA programs. And so I appreciate what you're doing to the Ambassadors to bring in men into this conversation, how we can support each other in the program. So excellent work. Zane, as we do with all of our guests, we'd love to kick off with a candid conversation you've had around gender equality, gender interactions. And I understand you have a story you'd like to share with our listeners.
Yeah, well, and actually what you were just saying about the numbers here at the IU MBA program, I just found out the new class is going to be 35% women.
Yay! Oh my God, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's definitely, there's still obviously room to improve, but a big step in the right direction. Even my class was 29%. So it's a pretty big jump all at once.
That's great.
So excited for the new class. And yeah, as to candid conversations, it's really interesting in the MBA program because you end up speaking with people in all sorts of companies, all sorts of levels of companies. And what I've found from just my own interest in this and wanting to get additional opinions on it is that everyone finds talking about gender equality awkward.
Mm-hmm.
I've at first started talking maybe to women about their experiences in different companies, and then started realizing that the onus shouldn't always be on women to explain what has happened to them or have those conversations. So I switched in the course of a lot of the kind of networking calls, interactions I've had. As I'm looking at a company, I want to go to a company that I know either is diverse or at least working to become more diverse. So I've just started to be more direct with the questions I have with peers or alumni about their experiences. And it's always just a little weird and awkward. I think, especially men talking to men, we're not sure we have the vocabulary for it, I think, or we're afraid of saying the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. So I've started approaching it as just acknowledging that up front. Like, hey, this is a weird question. You may not always get asked it. I'm just interested in your candid opinion. You don't have to put a bow around it. I'm not looking to catch anyone out or anything like that. Yeah. And I think definitely acknowledging that awkwardness up front definitely helps to deflate it.
Yeah. Yeah. And just this whole expectation, it has to be perfect. Or, the man-to-man conversation, there's so much fascinating research about masculinity. and the stigma we put on men having any sort of emotional dialogue. I mean, it's just kind of forbidden in our culture, which seems ridiculous. I mean, you have emotions just as women do. It's completely okay to express them. But when you do, it can be, people can kind of perceive it as like, whoa, where's he coming from? Oh man, is he hitting on me? I mean, we go to like these interesting places in our brain that are usually not true, but it's hard to have that conversation. I appreciate you underscoring that awkwardness that it can potentially be.
Well, it's interesting you say that about masculinity. I think male allies, both here at school where things can be maybe too competitive, as well as out in the workplace, some of the things that you can do is just, I think, broaden the definition of what masculinity can look like, and especially what success can look like, which often gets equated with masculinity. And I think that's detrimental for both men and women. And that's definitely, I think, a part of this conversation.
Absolutely. Acknowledging it, broadening it, because it does tend to be very boxed in. Both of our gender norms, if we just put people in those boxes, right, with femininity and masculinity, they're quite limiting. And people are often much more fluid between them. I identify with multiple factors in both of those boxes. And so I like your term about broadening it. It stretches people's thinking, though. I mean, people that are used to certain norms and expectations from a time you're a young child, it's unlearning some of the behavior we've been ingrained in society. So
yeah, for sure. I think especially when you start looking at things like leadership and how you should manage and how a boss should behave.
Yeah,
there's a lot of things we put into that already that we need to start.
Yeah, and I'm interested, Zane. So you're in an interesting position, right, in the MBA program, going into year 2. You had a summer internship. Your classmates have all, are coming back on a campus with different experiences from their summers, and you're having new students come in. So, wow, what an interesting perspective to have around this topic about gender equality and being somewhat at mid-career, approaching, the middle part of your career, if you will. What are you seeing out there from the companies that recruit on campus, from the stories you're hearing from your classmates about the focus on gender equality and diversity inside organizations today?
Well, all conversations around this, it's really hard to differentiate between companies that are just signaling good intentions versus, I think, companies that actually have good intentions. I try to accept people at their word. I guess my rule of thumb for all interactions is I'm going to take your word until you prove it otherwise to me.
Nice.
And I think especially any recruiter that comes on campus is going to be talking about diversity and inclusion. It's definitely, I don't think, a taboo anymore. It's something that companies are trying to address up front. Conversations I've had with recruiters at various companies are very forward about it. And I think very interested in this probably current generation of students or people that have recently graduated as well. Millennials, I guess we are. And I think there's an awareness from companies that this is something that matters more to us, which is a really interesting opportunity for this current generation to, I think, drive change. I've had a lot of good conversations with recruiters or even HR people at companies I've worked with in the past about what kind of change is expected now.
That's great. Well, and I think it's interesting, Zane, too, wanting to be a catalyst for positive change. I think a lot of times when I'm talking with people later in their career, they look to the younger generation and they're like, oh, the young millennial men, they're going to come in and make a difference. Or, I think we have a habit of kind of looking to the younger generation to solve the problems that were created by the older generations. So I'm curious from your perspective, I mean, do you feel like your voice is heard? I mean, being somebody that's passionate about this and a male ally, how is your voice heard inside organizations? And I know you just had this experience, right, with championing the Me Ambassadors program, getting that launched. How do people take it? When you use your voice, how do people, what response do you usually see?
It varies for sure. I have never had a negative response.
Okay.
Maybe I've had some, maybe befuddlement would be a better word of like, is this a thing? Why do you care about it?
Sure.
But I've never had anyone respond in aggressively or in agitation or anything like that. Okay. And I think in terms of the maybe intergenerationality between the current leaders in business and then people that are currently giving MBA programs, they're just as uncomfortable speaking to this as the current generation is. But I think us coming in, going out to these workplaces, I'm very interested in hearing how everyone's internships have gone, is a really good opportunity for us to almost model that this is an okay thing to talk about. And by us, I mean the current generation.
Yeah.
Because so Crane's just published a few months ago their best places to work in Chicago. And one of the interesting statistics that they included for the first time was the male to female ratio of the executive team.
Oh, nice.
Which, I was really excited to see it. It was I think it was just that ratio, number of employees, and like average salary were the three kind of statistics they pulled out. And no company is doing phenomenally at this.
Yep.
I think every company wants to be doing better. And having more people at companies kind of willing to ask, what's going on? What are we doing about this? Why is it this way? I think it's just going to keep getting the ball rolling and get some real momentum going.
Yeah. Yeah. Employees from the bottom up sharing that they indeed do care, that I would argue metrics do matter. And it doesn't mean you have to set a goal that we want to be 50-50 by 2020 something. I mean, that's hard to do. Yet when you're measuring it over time and you're showing simply the ratio of the C-suite, most C-suites, it's a 4-to-1 easily.
Yeah.
And I suspect that's probably what you saw in that report. And it's pretty startling when people see that, because their vantage point is they've seen one female VP. And usually I'm very generalization here, HR, marketing. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
When you start to see females in CFO, COO positions, they get deeper inside the trenches of the organization in non-traditional female quote unquote work. That's when you really start to move the needle, because women look up and they don't feel that they're so different, right? That they can identify with those roles and they see themselves reflected in the highest ranks of an organization.
Yep.
So what's interesting about the statistic you were sharing earlier about the Kelly program is 35% is what we call critical mass. So once you get to about a third, it's a tipping point where, you're not at 50-50, but you're a lot closer to 50-50 than you were being 25%. And so it's a very interesting kind of statistical slide. There's been research done in this that supports that women start to feel less different at that critical mass. And it starts to build more positive momentum. Now, where organizations struggle is they're sitting at 15-20% instead of 35%. So how do you get to that critical mass? And I think what you're highlighting here, Zane, quite nicely is it's an ongoing, continued conversation that we do care about this. We are not perfect. We're trying to figure it out. We're open to feedback. Tell us what we can do. Have allies involved in that conversation, and it's not going to go away, right? It's not a diversity pitch you give at a career fair. It's an ongoing conversation that happens once you start working there.
Yep.
We measure it. We care. We're holding ourselves accountable to specific action steps to drive positive change. So with that said, Zane, I'd love to hear the story of how you got the Kelly Ambassadors program started, what you're seeing now, where you're going. Help us, our listeners, understand where you're at.
Well, so it was actually started by the Kelly women. I don't know the actual details of when the decision was made to get it going, but I know early last year there was some interest in it, and then that turned into kind of a call out to men to see if anyone wanted to help with the visioning, putting together the mission and things like that. So most of what we did last year was put together the mission statement, just a broad overlines of what we wanted to do this year. At the very end of last year, we did a survey about just perceptions around gender equality amongst the students. Nice. I'm going to be crunching those numbers in the next week or two here to make a report to get this semester started. And we'll have a kickoff meeting probably in just 2 or 3 weeks here. But I'm very interested to see how it goes. We did have one meeting last year, just kind of introducing the group, getting more men involved, and we had very, very good turnout and some really, really good conversations, which actually I should thank you for some of that. Some of the conversations we had were ideas that came from you about, if there were more allies here at Kelly, how might it be different?
Nice. Like the gender equality, the 5 questions to start gender equality in your or your organization.
Yep.
Yeah, open-ended questions like that. That's so great. So if you had to summarize, I know you're digging through the data now, but if you had to summarize some key findings from that research, what struck you?
So the basic questions that I've looked at so far, just kind of the broad, do men and women agree or disagree on how women are treated? Or let me try to remember how the question was put. Are men and women treated equally in general? And about 20% of men strongly agreed, whereas about 20% of women strongly disagreed. The majority, though, or at least the plurality of both men and women disagreed that men and women are currently treated equally. And that's in general. So that's not necessarily here at school or in our careers. At work, it was pretty similar. So the question was, are men and women treated equally at work? Pretty similar. Men definitely probably closer to the agree side of things, but still a plurality saying that they disagree that men and women are treated equally at work. And then here at Kelly, it was a lot more ambiguous. No one really strongly felt that men and women are treated unequally.
Sure.
And most people agreed that there's more equality here at Kelly, which was good to see. I think there's definitely more that can be done. But at least people are positive about what's going on here, which I think is a great example of why this is a great place to have the conversation.
Yep.
Have those awkward moments figured out here at school before we're all out in our careers.
Yeah, it's a safe place to have this dialogue. So with that in mind and kind of underscoring the awkwardness of which these conversations can shape in day-to-day interactions, especially more corporate, buttoned up political settings. How at Kelly, how do you see this transcending into the workplace? How do you see, having these candid conversations, having a dialogue with allies and women and knowing that the perceptions are more equal there? How do you take that with you a year from now when you graduate and take that into the workplace?
I think there's two main things that I'm hoping to accomplish with the ambassadors. One is that the men here at Kelly now kind of open their eyes to this, are aware of what they could and should be doing to support women, especially as we start getting into leadership roles as MBA students. We're all aiming for leadership roles. What can we be doing to make sure women on our teams are being mentored, having the same opportunities as men, and not being, I think, blind to some of what's going on? And then what I'm starting to realize from all the conversations I've had with different recruiters, there's a really strong signal that we can be sending to companies that you need to really step up your recruiting game, because this is something that this generation cares about.
Right.
And I think that's actually, because I'm not going to be in a hiring position next year. I'm probably not even going to be in a hiring position in 5 years. I mean, we'll see. But so I'm not going to be the person doing the hiring, recruiting, able to help that directive away necessarily, but making sure that companies know it's a thing to worry about, care about, and make progress on, I think will shift the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I love those two themes. When you get super focused with these are the objectives, this is what we're driving, we're super focused on having that ongoing conversation and recruiting talent. What's interesting, Zane, is that you have to have both, right? With recruiting diverse talent, and you also have to have the inclusion of the culture to support diverse talent wanting to work there. So again, you have a bit of a kind of chicken and egg problem, but as you continue to move the needle and get to that critical mass that we were talking about earlier, it becomes less of an issue. So I like that focus area, and it'll be exciting to watch you from the sidelines. Hopefully I'll have the chance to come down and participate in the event this year. And I love to see the work that you're doing, and the passion you have for this topic is tremendous, and being willing to step into this dialogue, ask those open-ended questions, learn from women, what it's like to be them, and open up the dialogue for men to talk to men about this, because I've found there's a tremendous amount of allies that are untapped out there, that if you can get them, especially young, like you're doing early in their career, they can take those tools and create this positive change in organizations that help us over this hump. So I appreciate you. Zane, how can our listeners follow you? How can they stay in touch with you?
I am not currently, thanks to being busy with school, really doing anything other than Twitter, which you can find me at ZT Davis. And then I'm always open to have conversations if anyone wants to shoot me an email, and that's just ztdavis@iu.edu.
Absolutely.
The basic rule of thumb is if you look up ZT Davis, I'm usually that person.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. And I'll put those links in the show notes as well, Zane. Thanks so much for being with us today. Best of luck with the Kelly Ambassadors. And it's really exciting to see the work that you're doing. Thank you for listening to the Pivot Point podcast and our candid conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to share it with a friend or subscribe to our channel. You can also follow us at Next Pivot Point on social media and check out our website for free, amazing resources to support your candid conversation journey. It's www.nextpivotpoint.com. Thank you.